Imagine you're standing in the middle of an arena. 80,000 people are screaming around you. The sand beneath your feet is packed and dark, stained from whatever happened here yesterday. Across from you stands another man. A man who has trained his entire life for this exact moment. He's carrying weapons you've never seen before. His armor is unlike anything in your experience. And the crowd isn't just watching. They're deciding whether you live or die. Now here's the thing. Most of what you think you know about this moment is wrong. The thumbs, the death sentence, the mindless brutality. Hollywood has spent a century lying to you about Roman gladiators, and honestly, the real story is so much more fascinating than the version you were sold. Because here's what nobody tells you. There were over a dozen completely different types of Roman gladiators, each with their own weapons, their own armor, their own rules of combat, and their own place in a system so carefully designed and so ruthlessly strategic that it makes modern combat sports look like backyard wrestling. And understanding each type doesn't just explain how they fought. It reveals exactly what Rome wanted you to feel, and exactly what they wanted you to think. So today, we're going through every major kind of Roman gladiator, one by one. And by the end, you're going to see the arena in a completely different way. Before we get to the types, you need to understand one thing about how the gladiatorial system actually worked, because it changes everything. The matches weren't random. The Romans were not throwing two strangers into an arena and hoping for chaos. The entire system was built around specific matchups, specific types of fighters set against each other to create the most visually compelling and strategically interesting combat possible. Think of it less like a blood sport and more like the world's most brutal game design. The Romans actually thought about counterplay. They thought about style versus style, speed versus strength, reach versus mobility. And they had names for all of it. The fighters themselves came from all walks of life. Some were slaves. Some were prisoners of war, captured from the edges of the empire and forced into training schools called ludi. But here's the part that surprises most people. Some were volunteers. Free men and occasionally free women who chose to enter the arena because the money was extraordinary, the fame was real, and the life of a trained gladiator, even in captivity, was better fed, better housed, and better cared for than most of Rome's civilian poor. A successful gladiator was a celebrity. Their face appeared on pottery, on oil lamps, on children's toys. They had fan clubs. They received love letters. Now, keep all of that in your head, because the types we're about to go through aren't just categories. Each one represents a different philosophy of combat, a different piece of the Roman spectacle machine. The Murmillo. Let's start with the one you probably picture first, even if you don't know his name. The Murmillo was the heavy fighter, the tank of the arena. He carried a large rectangular shield called a scutum, which was the same shield used by the Roman legions, and a short stabbing sword called a gladius. His helmet was distinctive and immediately recognizable. A wide-brimmed, enclosed design with a tall crest on top that reportedly looked like a fish fin. The name itself might come from the Greek word for a type of fish. He was covered in armor on his right arm and left leg, but his torso was largely exposed, intentionally so because Rome wanted the crowd to see the danger. A Murmillo fight wasn't supposed to look safe. It was supposed to look terrifying and winnable at the same time. The Retiarius. Now flip everything you just imagined completely upside down. The Retiarius is the most visually radical gladiator in the entire system, and probably the most strategically interesting. He carried a weighted net, a long trident, and a dagger. That's it. He wore almost no armor, just a large metal shoulder plate called a gallerus on his left arm to deflect blows to the neck. No helmet, no shield. His face was completely visible to the crowd, which made him uniquely vulnerable emotionally, not just physically. The crowd could see his fear. They could see his focus. They could see when he was losing hope. The Retiarius was designed to be the most human gladiator in the arena, and the most hated. Romans associated his style of fighting, using a net, fighting from a distance, running when outmatched, with cowardice and femininity. The crowd often jeered him. He was the heel of the gladiatorial world. And yet he kept appearing for centuries because he was also genuinely terrifying to fight. The Secutor. You can't talk about the Retiarius without talking about the Secutor, because these two were designed specifically to fight each other. The Secutor was the Retiarius's permanent rival, his designated opponent, his mirror image. Where the Retiarius was light and agile, the Secutor was heavily armored. He carried a scutum like the Murmillo and a gladius, but his helmet was completely unique. Smooth, rounded, with tiny eye holes so small that the Retiarius's trident couldn't pierce through them. Every single piece of his design was an answer to the Retiarius's weapons. The rounded helmet so the net would slide off. The small eye holes so the trident couldn't hook in. The heavy shield to block the trident's thrusts. But here's the problem the Secutor lived with. Inside that smooth, sealed helmet, he could barely breathe. He had to end the fight quickly because if the Retiarius kept moving, kept running, kept him chasing across the hot arena sand, the Secutor would gas out. He would physically suffocate in his own armor. This was the matchup the Roman crowd absolutely loved. The slow, suffocating heavy fighter trying desperately to catch the nimble, terrifying netman before his own helmet killed him. The Thraex, pronounced Thraex, represented Rome's most famous conquered enemy. The Thracians, from what is now modern Bulgaria and northern Greece. His weapon was a curved sword called a sica, which curved backward at the blade, almost like a reversed scimitar. This design let him hook around an opponent's shield. An incredibly clever counter-technique against fighters who relied on large rectangular shields for protection. He carried a small square buckler called a parmula, wore heavy leg armor on both legs, and his helmet was topped with a griffin, the mythological creature. The Thraex was one of the most popular gladiator types in all of Rome. Emperors declared their favorites publicly. Caligula supported the Thraex faction. Domitian supported the Murmillo faction. When these two types met in the arena, it wasn't just a fight. It was political. The Hoplomachus. If the Thraex represented Rome's northern enemies, the Hoplomachus represented Greece. Specifically the classical Greek hoplite soldier that Rome both admired and had spent centuries competing with. He carried a long spear and a small round shield, wore a full-plumed helmet, and also carried a short sword as a backup weapon. The Hoplomachus was the gladiator most often matched against the Murmillo, which created an interesting symbolic dynamic. Rome, represented by the Murmillo's Roman legion shield and sword, fighting Greece, represented by the Hoplomachus's spear and phalanx round shield. The crowd understood the symbolism. These weren't just fights. They were living theater. The Provocator. The Provocator was different from almost every other type in one very specific way. He was the only gladiator who almost exclusively fought other provocators. While most gladiatorial matchups were designed around contrasting styles, the Provocator fought mirror image battles. He carried a curved rectangular shield, wore a breastplate called a cardiophylax, one of the only chest armor pieces in the entire gladiatorial system, and wielded a gladius. His helmet had a distinctive forward-angled crest. The Provocator bouts were considered more like tests of pure combat skill than dramatic style clashes, which appealed to the more militarily minded segment of the Roman audience. The Dimachaerus. Here's where things get genuinely unusual. The Dimachaerus carried two swords. No shield, no defensive weapon of any kind, just a blade in each hand. His name literally means two-knife man. He wore light armor and relied entirely on offensive aggression and dual-weapon technique. He is one of the least documented gladiator types, which makes him frustrating for historians and fascinating for everyone else, because the Romans apparently considered him exotic enough to be worth featuring but not stable enough to be a regular matchup category. He may have been more of a specialty act, brought out for special occasions, unusual shows, the kind of fighter the editor, the man organizing the games, would deploy to shake up the audience when they'd seen too much of everything else. The Essedarius. Now we reach one of the most spectacular types. The Essedarius, the chariot fighter. These gladiators were modeled on the Celtic warriors that Julius Caesar encountered during his campaigns in Britain. They fought from chariots, or at least began the fight in chariots, and were among the most visually impressive acts in the arena's repertoire. The logistics alone were staggering. Getting a chariot into the arena, managing the horses, coordinating combat at speed. All of this was incredibly difficult, which is probably why the Essedarius appeared mostly in large-scale spectacles sponsored by emperors, rather than the everyday gladiatorial games put on by local politicians. When they appeared, it was an event within the event. What you've just walked through isn't simply a list of fighting styles. It's a window into how Rome organized power, spectacle, and public emotion on a mass scale. Every gladiator type was a character in an ongoing drama. The matchups were chosen to create tension and narrative. The crowd wasn't just watching violence, they were being given stories. Heroes, villains, underdogs, titans. The arena was Rome's most sophisticated piece of mass media, and it ran for nearly 1,000 years. The next time someone mentions gladiators and you picture a single helmeted figure in a sandpit, remember the net man gasping for air while the Secutor chases him across the sand. Remember the blind man swinging in the dark while the crowd laughs. Remember the Thraex with his curved blade hooking around a shield while two emperors, on opposite sides of the arena, argue about who's going to win. Rome didn't just build the greatest empire in the ancient world. They built the greatest show.